that we started the dance last time.
We started a dance?
Yeah, we did.
And we're live.
We're
Or I
live?
think we are. Pretty
Are we
sure we
live?
are.
Are we seriously live?
Yes, we are now live.
Okay, well, it's great to be with you. It's March 19th today, 2021. March 19th is every year after 2003. Every year, March 19th is the anniversary of the US opening up its illegal war against Iraq, which cost millions of people's lives. It's a day I think that we should always remember, the day the United States went to war against Iraq for no reason, where the US diplomatic personnel lied at the UN Security Council. This includes the lies told by US Secretary of State Colin Powell. Later, Colin Powell, at least via his chief of staff, Larry Wilkerson, said that he had been misinformed by the CIA. Either way, the war was built on a very, very fraudulent foundation. The world did not go along with it. The US went alone. You got to remember this when you read Joe Biden's comment calling Vladimir Putin a killer. Uh, Biden calls Putin a killer. Putin's response is, well, it takes one to know one. And he probably was describing himself. Meanwhile, in Anchorage, Alaska, the United States high diplomats Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan sat down today and talked to two very senior Chinese diplomats, including Wang Yi. And the two Chinese diplomats, Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi, sat down at this meeting in Anchorage, Alaska. Blinken and Sullivan opened the meeting, launching an attack on the Chinese, talking about Xinjiang, talking about Hong Kong, talking about how China is outside the rule based order. Now, bear in mind, friends, this is on the anniversary of the day that the United States government illegally attacked Iraq. They're lecturing the Chinese about the rules based system. Both Wang and Yang fought back and said that the United States is a country that does policy through hooliganism. Very strong language from the Chinese today at Anchorage, Alaska. Wang returns to Beijing to have a visit with Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister of Russia, who will spend 2 days in China. Matters are very tense between the United States and China. It's impossible to open this show today on the 19th of March, 2021, without talking about that. You're listening to Give the People What They Want with Zoe and Prashant from People's Dispatch, the best movement storyteller available, and me, Vijay from Globetrotter. I opened today with China and the United States because, really, because this is a serious issue. We have a U.S. Navy Admiral, Philip Davidson, going before the U.S. Armed Services Committee and talking about how they need $5 billion for the Indo-Pacific Command to pressure China by military means. And Davidson said something which I would have hoped would have been front page news around the world. Davidson said the United States military must, and this is a direct quote, he says the United States military must be prepared to fight against China. Be prepared to fight against China. $27 billion over the next few years to the Indo-Pacific Command, hypersonic cruise missiles, this, that, and the other thing. Very chilling. Prashant, in Stockholm, the Stockholm Institute, which annually releases its report on arms sales and on military budgets and so on, has released their annual report. It has a pretty interesting headline. Lots of people say, well, the United States is building up its military to confront the buildup of the Chinese military. I was interested to read the Stockholm Institute's headline, at least. I haven't yet got down to reading the report. Prashant, what did you see in the report?
Right, Vijay. It's actually a very fascinating report that it's just the 12-page fact sheet itself gives you a lot of interesting insights into what is happening with regards to arms sales. And this is probably a very good measure of where we are as a world, as a civilization right now. On the face of it, one interesting fact is from 2016 to 20, there's been a slight decrease in the overall arms sales. But there are a lot of other trends which are quite harmful or dangerous. And I think some of these trends are going to come back again and again in some of our discussions. For instance, despite all the, say, rhetoric of the United States, Russia and China's arms exports have actually decreased slightly, whereas the United States or France for that matter, then their arms exports numbers have actually increased when compared to the previous period. Now, if you look at the top five arms exporters, you have the United States, Russia, France, Germany, and China. And like I said, the US and France have increased, Russia and China, their arms exports have increased. If you look at the top importers, you have Saudi Arabia, India, Egypt, Australia, and China again. And it's especially important because what this shows is while globally there has been maybe a slight decline compared to the previous 5 years, in the Middle East, there's actually been a considerable increase. That's 25% increase in arms imports in the Middle East countries. And which are the key countries you're talking about here? Like the list obviously shows Saudi Arabia and Egypt, of course, two important countries. Saudi Arabia especially important because it's the world's largest arms importer in 2016 to 2020. And say 79% of where to say 79% of the arms imports of Saudi Arabia come from the United States. Now the question is, where do these weapons go? And it's very, very clear. These weapons are being used to bomb people in Yemen, to bomb children in Yemen, to destroy their lives, to cause what the UN itself has called the greatest humanitarian disaster of our times. And this is a trend that has continued for many, many years. So we have, of course, seen expressions of concern by, say, various officials in the US administration when Trump was in power. Of course, the Democrats made a lot of noise about it. But if you go by the cardinal principle of follow the money, I think the trend is very clear that basically you have this brutal war which is being completely or largely being supported by United States weapons. And if you the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia on one hand, the US and Egypt on the other, the US and Israel on the other, the arms relationship, so to speak, I think it gives us perhaps the most clear indication into what is causing conflict in that part of the world. Because the West and the United States, irrespective of whoever is in power, likes to blame Iran. But the question here is, where are the weapons? Where is the money going and where are the weapons coming from? And that's very clear because it's going to all these countries. The other interesting fact, of course, is that while India's arms imports have slightly decreased, the India-Israel arms relationship has strengthened much more. And what do you call it? So I think 43% of India's arms purchase comes from Israel now. So that's a considerable amount that is there, and it's actually a very dangerous trend because across the world, for instance, a day before yesterday, we saw protests in Canada against buying of drone equipment from Israel, which is manufactured by Elbit Systems. In the UK, Elbit Systems factories have been targeted by protesters. But in India, what we've seen is, especially since the Modi government came to power, there's been a very close nexus between India and Israel in terms of technology in general, but especially military technology. So I think the trends basically see are not very positive either, because the fact sheet also talks about a lot of trade arms deals that are already in place, haven't been executed. So for instance, you have the United Arab Emirates, which is on the verge of signing quite a few deals. Some of them didn't get completed in 2020, but those could be quite big in this coming period as well. The UAE, as we know, is another key member of this war on Yemen. And I think a lot of our analysis of West Asia, the politics of it often kind of fails to take in account this fact that this is the amount of money, this is the amount of sheer weapons of murder that are being. And it's interesting because the war in Iraq was done on the argument of weapons of mass destruction, but this is actually what is actually happening on the ground, despite all those protestations. This kind of sales, and there's no sign of it coming down either.
Well, you're talking about largely military sales by arms dealers to militaries. Of course, a very big industry is sales to police forces. And we should write to CIPRI and say you need to track the police sales as well. In November 2019, the US State Department brokered through a company called X International, run by a Haitian man by the name of Kappa, who used to be in the US military, brokered a sale to the Haitian National Police of riot gear and so on. You've seen in Paraguay, in Haiti, the use of this highly sophisticated repressive military equipment by the police. Both in Haiti and in Paraguay, we've seen this repressive stuff, but we've seen people just continue to be out on the street. Zoe, what's happening in Paraguay? What's happening in Haiti? What are we seeing in these protests? Why are people on the street?
Yes, well, as you said, there's a great increase in repression, and we see, globally how repressive governments are working together, how they're buying not only training, but weapons. I mean, it's a whole, international level of collusion, and it's actually quite interesting to look at these partnerships and agreements on a deeper level. But within, right now in Haiti and Paraguay, people have been on the streets for weeks. In Paraguay, these protests started at the beginning of March. In Haiti, of course, we've been covering this. The latest wave of protests began in January, but, the people of Haiti have been, en masse protesting for the past 3 years. But I guess I'll start with Paraguay because I think it's kind of a less known case. Paraguay is often a really forgotten country in Latin America. It's landlocked. People don't really, maybe they know about the coup that happened in 2012, the parliamentary coup against Hugo. But beyond that, it's kind of, it's between Brazil and, Argentina. But what's really going on there? We've done a couple of stories at People's Dispatch about these protests that began in the beginning of March. Like so many protests we've seen throughout the pandemic, people have just been brought to the brink with the mismanagement of the pandemic. It's not enough. It's not, not only are they losing their livelihoods because of the economic impact of the lockdown, the economic impact, just the global deepening of this economic crisis, which we know didn't start with the lockdown has been, deepened. But in addition, in a lot of countries, the death rate, the infection rate, the impact on people's lives of actually their family members dying, not getting health care, the desperation of the breakdown of the public health system is not just, we talk a lot about how the health systems are deteriorating, but the actual toll that this plays in people's lives is really too great to measure. Of course, we see this in Brazil as well. And so in Paraguay, the government had been really mismanaging the pandemic. People have talked about how, healthcare workers still weren't getting proper PPE. There just hasn't been enough investment in protecting the people and putting their needs first. And so people started protesting once there was a massive spike in COVID cases, a big spike in deaths as well. Of course, the numbers, when you compare it to the rest of the region, the numbers themselves, absolute numbers are not super high, but the increase that was seen and the impact on the population has been extremely high. The president of Paraguay is from the Colorado Party, and this is the party that was of the last dictator in Paraguay. So there's, a direct legacy to this repressive politics, a number of things that happened under this regime of Mario Abdo Benitez. We talked about in our first article about the protests, how in November and September, there was a series of kind of scandals involving the murder of 2 young Argentinian girls. This has actually created kind of an international issue because 2 young girls were murdered by the army. And so people just have had enough. They're on the streets. They've been on the streets of Paraguay, Asunción, and the capital for the past, since, March 3rd. Now, in a really amazing kind of show of support and force, peasant organizations have joined, the young people in the cities. They're doing a march from the rural regions to the city to support these protests. And essentially the people are calling for the resignation of this right-wing government that has shown time and time again that they're not protecting the people, that people are suffering, and that they don't really care. There have been a couple of cosmetic changes. The health minister resigned because the parliament actually passed a resolution saying that he had to. But really, there hasn't been much response from the executive government. And then, of course, in Haiti, people continue to be on the streets. Now we're almost a month and a half into the illegal overstaying of Jovenel Moise's term. Of course, according to the Constitution, his term ended on February 7th. He remains in power thanks to the United States, thanks to the OAS. And people are continuing to be on the streets. They're protesting in front of these symbolic sites, for example, the U.S. Embassy, and calling on the U.S. to stop their hypocritical position towards Haiti. If they claim to support human rights in Latin America, why are they supporting a dictator? Why are they supporting someone who's violating the Constitution?
Well, this is, of course, a problem we've seen globally, this issue of where what I suppose is called lawfare, where various means are used to overthrow governments or to delegitimize people who are speaking out. We've seen recently some of this get overturned. Lula, had his lawfare conviction invalidated, gave a tremendous 3-hour speech laying out attack on the Bolsonaro government, whose approval rating then plummeted. We saw in Bolivia the interim president who came in after the coup of November 2019, get arrested. Sometimes these things are reversed. So history, as we keep saying on this show, history goes in zigs and zags. This is Give the People What They Want, with Zoe, Prashant, and me from People's Dispatch and Globetrotter, with you every Friday, but also, of course, on the regular podcasting platforms. And boy, there are so many of them. Who knew that there were so many podcasting platforms? Britain has been convulsed around the death of a young woman, Sarah Everard. Police, the police is quick to go and attack protesters. They just don't want to investigate when a young woman disappears. Turns out, well, her disappearance was related to the Metropolitan Police Department. People are very upset in the United Kingdom. People had been very upset 10 years ago in Egypt when they went out on the street. Now, once again, this charge of spreading fake news. Have we not seen this before? Prashant, what is happening in Egypt, and why do these activists keep getting picked up by the authorities on this charge of spreading fake news?
Absolutely, Vijay. Like we talked about the arms sales and how Egypt tops there. Similarly, Egypt's record is just appalling on the issue you mentioned, and the most recent example of this is it's quite tragic when we go back and check, for instance, the PD archives on Egypt, because it's just case after case. So what we saw very recently was that Sana Saif, a 27-year-old activist who, like you said, in the Arab Spring protest 10 years ago, she was at Tahrir Square. She was documenting many of these issues. After that, after Abdel Fattah el-Sisi became a dictator, came to power in 2013, she's spoken out continuously on these issues. Her whole family has been persecuted, of course, we'll come to that. But the recent news is that she's been sentenced to 1 year and 6 months in prison on I think the charges need to be really talked about here, and we should, just for the absurdity of it. So it's spreading fake news, disturbing security and peace, and disrupting the institutions of the state from their work, and wait for it, insulting a police officer on a Facebook post. So these are basically the charges for which somebody is going to jail for 18 years, and she's already been in prison since June. That's last year. And the circumstances of her imprisonment are equally important, because the day before, her mother and sister had been protesting because their brother Abdul Fattah has been again in jail without a trial since September 2019. He was in jail for 5 years before that. So they're sitting outside the prison, they're protesting. They're beaten up by a group of women in plain clothes who are probably police personnel. The next day, these three activists are going to file a complaint on this, the fact that they were beaten up brutally while protesting peacefully. And then Sana Saif is abducted. And after that, this is when since then she's been held. She was abducted for a while, then presented in court. And now she has been sentenced to 18 months in jail on these really absurd charges. And what's important to note here, of course, is that this is absolutely not a outlier incident or anything of this sort. Last year, Her mother, her aunt, the novelist Atta Soef they were also arrested because they were demanding that during COVID, prisoners should be given proper protection. In the time of the pandemic, for that they were again detained for a couple of days. Just a few months ago, we had members of the Egyptian Institute for the EIPR, basically the Egyptian Initiative for Protection of Rights. They were arrested again after meeting with ambassadors of Western countries. We've had journalists like the journalists of Mada Masar, the editor-in-chief of Mada Masar, other journalists, women journalists being arrested again for writing about the state. The number of prisoners is believed to be, political prisoners is believed to be around somewhere in the realm of, say, 60,000 or something. And that is a huge number for a country like Egypt. And there's been almost no accountability. There have been protests in 2019 and 20, each of which was followed by mass arrests again and again. Very little action from the courts. And despite all this, we have Egypt being supported by successive United States administrations, European administrations, primarily because it's such a vital cog in the West Asian strategy. So whether it be Yemen, whether it be Libya, the Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel nexus is the cornerstone of US foreign policy in this region. And so anything goes as far as, say, Egyptian policy is concerned. And it's been extremely repressive. Political parties there, for instance, facing a massive crackdown, the left facing a massive crackdown. So I think that it's probably one of the greatest tragedies of the post-Arab Spring situation, the kind of hope that it engendered in what Al-Sisi, especially with the aid of the Saudi Arabians and the United States, has done after that.
About a month ago, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres made a very important comment. He said that the world is experiencing a pandemic of human rights abuses. There are medics being arrested in countries because they are accused of spreading fake news. I mean, India is, I think, one of the countries with the largest number of arrests on this fake news charge. It's used extremely politically against people who are asking questions and so on. Look at the case of that young woman Disha Ravi. Was produced a kind of toolkit to assist farmers and was arrested on that charge. There really needs to be some kind of public accounting of this whole online accusations of doing things online and people getting picked up. But yes, we'll follow this case carefully. As you said, her brother Allah has been in and out of prison in Egypt, and I mean we are seized of this. I think all of us are to look carefully. Again, zigs and zags. There is a zig, there is a zag. Ecuador enters its second stage of elections. I mean, there is a kind of overwhelming democracy in some of these Latin American constitutions where there's a first round, a second round, and there's so much in between. This period between the first round, where Andres Arauz won the first round, but not by enough to set aside the second round, this period has been quite bizarre. We're seeing some very strange political things happen in Ecuador. Very strange. Zoe, please make sense of this for us.
Well, it's a big task, so I'll do my best, but I think you're right to say it's been very strange. It's almost like there's been so much happening with regards to the first round scrutiny, a lot of fake news from the right wing, a lot of accusations back and forth. It's almost felt like people have forgot there's a second round, and the discourse has been so much around the first round. What could potentially happen? I mean, there have been so many weird occurrences, which I'll try to get into some of them, but it has been weird. I mean, on April 11th, which is kind of D-Day for Latin America, because we have Ecuador second round, Bolivian local election second round, Chile and Peru general elections. And of course, with Chile, we're also having the elections for the Constitutional Assembly. So, I mean, there's a lot going on that day. But specifically when we're looking at Ecuador, I mean, this has been a key point of our coverage. It's been a key focus for a lot of people across the world just because of what it represents. I mean, we had Lenin Moreno, who gave this complete turn towards neoliberalism. And in these elections that are coming up on April 11th, which will finally, after a lot of scrutiny, a lot of back and forth with the National Electoral Council and different kind of courts that deal with elections, it has been officially confirmed that it will be a runoff between Guillermo Lasso, who's a conservative banker, and Andres Arauz, who you mentioned, of course, won the first round, but not by enough to win in the first round. In the background, and while all of this has been happening, the other candidate, Yacu Perez, who is from the Pachacuti party, who claims, being the operative word here, to be an eco-socialist, representative of indigenous movements, which of course I think this needs to be unpacked because a lot of major indigenous movements in Ecuador actually don't support his candidacy. They see him as a kind of neoliberal agent who's already expressed support for having a free trade agreement with the United States, is so anti-Korea, so anti-citizens revolution that his policies have just swung back towards the United States, towards, following the diktats of imperialism. There's just a lot. And so he was trying for a while to contest the first round elections, alleging fraud. He was supporting a lot of the fake news claims that Andres Arauz had received peculiar funding from illegal sources, just creating a whole hubbub around these first rounds. He also called for protests against the National Electoral Council. Finally, this body has kind of ruled, and that they have dismissed, there's the Electoral Dispute Court. So there are all these different kind of legal bodies, institutions that are dealing with these elections. They have ruled and they have dismissed his allegations of fraud. And so finally it's been confirmed, yes, it will be Lasso and Arauz. And all opinion polls, put Arauz first, and have saying that he has a clear advantage over Lasso. Of course, Ecuador has been submerged in a neoliberal crisis, so it's not surprising that a banker who wants to privatize, who wants to go even further than Lenin Moreno went, would not be well liked. So, we're hoping for a left victory in this case. We'll see what happens. As many experts have pointed out, nothing is off the table. So we have to be very, very careful and follow what's happening in Ecuador.
Follow what's happening. This is, of course, an axiom of reporting. Follow what's happening. Keep an eye on things. In 2009, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs is a rather clunky title, and then it goes on. It's the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in the Palestinian Territories. First started keeping numbers in 2009 of Israeli demolition of Palestinian homes. I remember in 2010 in the West Bank observing a house being demolished. The United Nations, in fact, had noted that house being demolished. Not just house, it was actually a street that was demolished by bulldozers. Just went past the anniversary of the death of a young American woman, Rachel Corrie, who was killed by one of those bulldozers as the Israeli state demolished illegally Palestinian homes. Well, on the 16th of March, remember, keep an eye on things, keep track of things. This same UN office, doggedly every year, releases a report on house demolitions. And on the 16th of March, they reported that in the first 2 months of this year, they have seen an acceleration of house demolition. And Lynn Hastings and other people at the office have made it very clear that the data is shocking. Israel is really on a war path to cleanse the West Bank of the Palestinians, to essentially annex this region, but annex it without its people. They want to create enough pain so that the people leave the West Bank, go to Jordan, and so on. It's what is sometimes called the four-state solution. In other words, to expel Palestinians to Egypt, to Lebanon, to Jordan, and to Syria. Not to have any Palestinians in what the Israeli state, in fact, calls Greater Israel. It's very shocking developments. Keep an eye on things. Yes, it seems like it's always the same sort of atrocities that keep happening over and over again. But as reporters, as sensitive people, concerned people, I think our watchword is keep an eye on things. Tell other people about these things, build movements around atrocities. I mean, isn't that what we're supposed to do? History moves in zigs and zags. It's not always the bad side that wins. Janet Agnes is in prison. Lula gives a big speech. The people came out to protest the death, the murder of a young woman in England. Lots of people in Haiti continue to protest to bring finally the fruit of the 1804 Haitian Revolution to bear. It's a funny business, our business of telling the news. We want to hear from you. We want to hear what you think of Give the People What They Want. We come to you every Friday. It's Zoe and Prashant from People's Dispatch. I highly recommend that you go and read People's Dispatch once or twice a day. Once is enough, I think. Once a day. Don't really bother with the other people. Come there, get informed. Come to us every Friday. It's a little dose of reality. At least that's what we think. Again, from People's Dispatch and Globetrotter, you've been listening to and watching Give the People What They Want. See you next week.
See you next week, comrades.